State Work Institute was founded by the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. We work to expand the worker cooperative model to reach communities most directly affected by social and economic inequality, especially recent immigrants, workers of color, and low-wage workforces. We do this through original research, training for worker cooperatives and developers, municipal partnerships, and more. I'm going to now hand it off to Mo, who will share a little bit about the Federation.
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Mo Mankling. I work for the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. So we're the national grassroots membership organization. I see a lot of our members already in here. Thank you for coming and being attentive to this work and participating in the census. So we are a national organization. We do education. We do convenings to bring worker owners and allies together. We do a lot of policy and advocacy work to both train up worker owners to kind of work in the policy realm, whether it's at their local city government or at their state or at the federal level. We also host a variety of member-driven councils and peer networks to help people to share resources, iterate faster, make us all faster, better, stronger businesses. And we are really excited always to work with Democracy at Work Institute, our sister organization, on pulling this information together that really helps us to kind of understand the movement. So you can go to the next slide, Olga, and just to help people place kind of like where this information came from. Earlier in 2019, we hosted the census, and that was a dual effort between DOWI and the Federation. Where we had it oriented around this campaign of together we count, right? It's really important that we understand how we as a movement are growing. It has been a really rapidly growing sector, definitely the fastest growing sector of the kind of wider cooperative region area. And the census is a really, really important part of that. So one of the main facets of being a member is that you opt in to taking the annual economic census, and that helps us to just gather information so we're able to pull together as much info as we can about you as businesses and then be able to reinterpret that. So that's what DOWI focuses on. So we want to take a moment to just thank everybody who participated. It's really, really important work. Special shout out to Shayla, who helped do a lot of the groundwork and calling people, following up, making sure that people took the census. So I just want to encourage you, if you didn't participate last year, make sure that you participate in the next one, because the more that we know, the better that we can advocate for worker co-ops or understand the movement, or make sure that everybody is hooked up with the resources that they need to really run their business well. So with that, I think I'll actually hand over to Olga, because I kind of talked about a lot of the purpose behind it. And then let's just keep going.
Thanks so much, Mo. So once again, I'm Olga. I'm the Metrics and Impact Analyst at the Democracy at Work Institute. I joined DOWI about 4 months ago, so I actually just joined the party right after a lot of the hard work of data collection and analysis for this was already over. So a huge thank you to all the DOWI and Federation staff who worked really hard to get this data to you all today. So I'm going to run through a little bit about the state of the sector. I'm going to walk through our methodology. I'm going to run through the results that we saw for this year of surveys. And then I'm going to run through some of our historical data that we've collected as well. So in terms of methodology, every year when we conduct the state of the sector, it starts out with a list of worker co-ops that we are aware of. A lot of that comes from the knowledge of the Federation, so any membership and outreach that's done, just general knowledge of our staff. We put together a huge list and we go through a verification process for each business to verify it as a worker co-op. So what does that mean? So in order to be verified as a worker co-op, a business must meet a few criteria. So that includes things like they must be generating revenue, they must have democratic governance, they must have a minimum of 3 paid workers, and they must be majority owned by their at least 3 workers. So we go through that process to verify businesses. So for this year of surveying, we came up with a list of 465 operational worker cooperative and democratic workplaces. So that number is not necessarily all inclusive. So we did want people to reflect on a full year of data when they're completing the survey. So we asked people to look back on fiscal year 2018. So businesses that were operational for only part of that year or maybe took off the ground after that time period would not be included in that count. There's other reasons maybe why a business might not be included in this count. Maybe they don't have a web presence, they don't publicly identify as a worker co-op, or we're just not aware of them in general. So because of all those reasons, we estimate that the actual number of worker cooperatives in the US is closer to 800. So each of those 465 businesses were asked to complete a survey. About 106 worker cooperatives responded, so that's a 23% response rate. And their survey itself was done between September and October of 2019. And I do want to point out that the survey content was changed minimally over the last few years, but throughout this presentation, I'll kind of point out the places where it was changed. And lastly, I do want to mention that there is some information we're able to collect even on survey non-responders. So we do kind of dig through publicly available information in order to understand the field more broadly. So we look for things like industry classification, age of business, geographic location, just to be able to still get a little bit of data, even if somebody doesn't respond to our survey. So like I mentioned, we identified 465 worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces across the US in fiscal year 2018. So together they employ an estimated 6,500 workers and produce about $505 million in revenue each year. The typical worker cooperative is pretty small, so about 8 workers, about $505,000 in revenue every year, and they tend to be pretty young, so under 6 years old. But I do want to point out that there's obviously very large and long-standing worker cooperatives that don't quite fit this mold. And in terms of historical data, this information on the slide has stayed pretty steady throughout the years. The only thing we've seen shift a little bit is this median number of workers. So it used to be closer to 10, it's now at 8. That likely just reflects the entrance of a lot of newer businesses, which tend to be smaller into the field. So the first year that we started doing the State of the Sector report was fiscal year 2013. That data came out in 2015. So at this point, we have about 6 years of data to look at in order to look at growth rate in the field, which is really exciting. So over the last 6 years, there's been a pretty steady growth of worker cooperatives. So a lot of that is obviously due to just growth in the field. Some of that might be due to us identifying worker co-ops better. And then the total growth that we've seen between 2013 and 2018 is about 35.7% net growth. So when I say net growth, we can also break that down by entries and exits into the field, so business openings and closings. If we look at the number of new startups, those have remained pretty steady over the years, so about 20 to 25 businesses each year. The number of positive conversions is generally trending upwards. And then when we look at business closures, those are generally pretty comparable to what we see for traditional small businesses in the US in general. And in terms of worker cooperatives by origin, about a quarter of all current worker co-ops are started as a conventional business. This figure has stayed pretty similar year to year. I do want to point out that this is actually one of those instances in which we include information on survey non-responders. So if there's publicly available information about whether a business is a conversion or a startup, we included it here. Unfortunately, that doesn't allow us to dig more deeply into this blue portion of the graph, the startups. So we can't quite discern whether a business is self-started or assisted by a developer without them responding to the survey. But 83 firms did provide an answer to this question for us. Only 18% reported that they were assisted by developers. That number seems pretty low, especially what we know about developer activity, especially in places like New York City. So this likely points to potentially a bias to who's participating in the survey. So maybe self-started startups are more likely to participate, or maybe just an unclear perception of the role of developers in the origins of some firms. So moving on to compensation, this year's survey, so 83 cooperatives shared both their total wages and total hours worked. And this allowed us to calculate an average wage for those firms. So we found it to be $19.67 an hour. The last year that we actually have this data for is fiscal year 2016, at which point it was $15.82. So that's a really optimistic increase. It's kind of exciting. So we definitely hope more research is done to try and understand that increase a little bit better, or to get a larger sample of worker co-ops, but it's definitely really promising. And it's especially promising because this is about $7 higher than the minimum wage in a lot of the states that have the most worker co-ops. In general, the entry level wage at worker co-ops ranged between $10 and $80 an hour, with most worker co-ops clustered around $12 to $15 an hour. And there was 18 cooperatives that reported entry level wages above $20, and they tended to be in sectors such as technology or consulting. And then we looked at patronage. So there was 37 survey responders that provided information about the amount of patronage they distributed in 2018. And then an additional 46 worker cooperatives said that they distributed no patronage during the year. So this allowed us to calculate the average amount of patronage distributed per worker owner, which was about $8,000. And then in terms of the worker co-ops themselves, so the average distribution was about $190,000, and the median distribution was about $20,000.
Well, I'll just jump in here really quickly just to talk a little bit about the fact that these numbers are really important, right? Especially and particularly how they shape up against small business numbers. So Olga shared a little bit about, you know, like how our general like base rate for like entry-level workers is higher than the typical small business. And that's really important, particularly when you're trying to make the case to like your local government, or you're trying to get people on board generally with the idea of worker co-ops and understand like, why is this a better model? A lot of things that we typically point to is the entry rate and the stability of the workforce and the business itself. And those are the kinds of things I think when we take these numbers and actually translate them into like what they could mean in real life and in real practice, I think it's really important to look at these and say like, okay, well, how can we make the case for worker co-ops, particularly in reflection of the current state of the economy or the current state of our, you know, even our local economy. So I think especially in sharing what things like patronage are, I see some people kind of sharing that in the chat, and helping people to understand that it's not just, you know, the salary of the worker, it's also a portion of the profits of the work itself. So at the end of the year, being able to share that wealth back to the people who are creating the value is really, really important. So it is important that we kind of like have a communal understanding of what those things are and how to talk about those with people outside the movement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mo. So the next thing we were able to look at in terms of compensation, we were able to look at pay ratio. So we compared the minimum and maximum wages at each business. And from doing that analysis, it's very clear that most worker cooperatives maintain a very flat wage structure, so either 2-to-1 or 1-to-1. And that's especially important, kind of what it says in the call out here. The traditional large US business has a top to bottom pay ratio of 303-to-1. So that kind of like puts this into a very stark comparison of how much worker cooperatives are prioritizing the reduction of this internal inequity. The next thing we were able to look at is worker demographics. This is going to look really familiar to a lot of you on the call. This has not changed much year to year at all. So women and people of color continue to make up the majority of the worker cooperative workforce, which differs starkly from the demographic breakdown of the overall US workforce, obviously. There's a lot of possible explanations for this. One of them could be that worker cooperatives are found across all sectors in the economy, but many of the largest and most long-standing worker co-ops can be found in fields like home care, residential care, childcare, all fields traditionally that have higher proportions of female and Latinx workers. And then this map shows the geographic distribution of worker cooperatives in the US. So as you can see, New York and California are the states that have the most worker cooperatives. They have about 17% of worker cooperatives each. The New England region also has about 17% of worker co-ops. In general, we've seen parts of the Midwest and Pacific Northwest growing as well, which is exciting. When we look at this data over the last 6 years, there's been some very notable changes in places like New York City. So there's been a lot of growth there, and that's undoubtedly due to the money that was set aside by the city towards worker co-op development, specifically starting in 2014. So we've seen a big growth in New York since that time, even allowing the New York City area to surpass the San Francisco area as the #1 spot for worker co-ops in the US. There's also been a lot of growth that we've seen of worker co-ops outside of areas that traditionally have had worker co-ops. So that might just point to a growth in popularity of the business form in general, allowing new businesses to start where we really haven't seen worker cooperatives in the past. And then it's also very important to mention that we're seeing growth in rural regions in all states. So for fiscal year 2018, we saw that 14% of all worker cooperatives are based in rural regions. And then, so the last thing we looked at was challenges. This was actually a new addition to the survey questionnaire this year. So survey responders were able to choose from a list of pre-selected options about challenges that their businesses face. So as you can see, some of the most commonly selected categories have to do with worker benefits or just overall business operational issues. It's important to note that administrative burdens was one of the top choices after worker benefit questions. And that might just point to difficulties that small businesses have with administrative items, or maybe like some sort of learning curve in terms of things like bookkeeping and invoicing, etc. One thing to note is you will not see access to capital listed as a challenge here. We kind of approached it as we know that access to capital is a challenge for all businesses, including worker cooperatives. So we structured this question to get an understanding of the challenges that worker co-ops face outside of access to capital. And this actually wraps up what we have to present to you for the State of the Sector report this year. So I do want to give some information in terms of some next steps. So I mentioned that we have about 6 years of data now for the state of the sector. So going forward, we really want to focus on capturing big shifts in the field. So we will be moving to doing this report every 2 years instead of annually. So the next time you'll see this report released will be in 2022, and it will cover information on fiscal year 2020 for businesses. In the meanwhile, we're not just gonna relax in a hammock. We're gonna pursue some other research goals. So we're gonna focus a lot on recruitment for the survey, kind of like Mo talked about in the beginning. And there's definitely a lot of work to be done outside of that as well. And then lastly, it's not all the time that we get to have a lot of very data-oriented people on a call together. So I did want to mention this other data initiative that Dowie and the Federation have open right now. So we don't traditionally make the state of the sector data publicly available, but we do have this different data set that was initially collected in 2017 in partnership with the University of Wisconsin. And it was the first national survey that asked worker owners about attitudes and experiences directly. There's about 1,100 people from 82 firms that responded to this 58-item questionnaire. And there's a little bit of qualitative data as well. So there was 15 in-depth interviews done with a randomly selected sample of those responders. So there is some research that's coming out that's based on this data pretty soon, but if you want to access this data directly, you can apply to access that following this link below. All right.
Great, thank you so much, Olga and Mo. Now we do have a bunch of questions here in the chat. I'm gonna try and get as many as we can, and then we'll give some time for people to unmute and ask questions directly as well. Susan asked what the difference is between the purple and blue on the map slide. Can either Mo or Olga go over that?
Sure. I actually am not sure. Mo, do you have the answer to that?
Sorry. Yeah, the blue actually just indicates where there are worker to owner collaborative partners in the area that are able to provide support. So, you know, as you can see, there's where you're seeing a lot of like different kinds of concentration that also, to a certain extent, reflects where there are developers to help support the work that's going on the ground. So that's noted in the printed version, but it's not in this map here.
Thank you. And Mike asks about the numbers in Puerto Rico, 50 worker cooperatives verified there, and if that's similar to previous reports, and what contributes to that number.
So from what I recall, this is actually the first year we were including those numbers. So we unfortunately don't have a lot of historical data on worker cooperatives in Puerto Rico.
Let me see what other questions here we may have. Can you go over the difference between the 465 total and the 800 total that was referenced in the beginning?
Sure. Like I mentioned, the way that that 465 number comes to be is that we verify worker co-ops to meet certain criteria. Some of those criteria, just for the purposes of the survey, include having to be operational for at least the full year of the survey that covers. So for us, that was fiscal year 2018. So if a business started partway through that year, or if they took off the ground after that time period, they would not be included in this count. And then there also might be instances of worker co-ops that we just are not aware of. So if they don't publicly identify as a worker co-op, if they don't really have a connection to the Federation or to DOWI or to our partners, we might not know about them. Or maybe if they're geographically in a place where there's not a lot of worker co-ops and we don't really have a presence, they might not be included in this count. So for that reason, since that's a lot of limitations to place on businesses, we actually estimate that it's closer to the 800 number that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that it also just gives like a really good view of the fact that, you know, like worker co-ops aren't new, right? They're people have been doing this work for a really long time, and they might not necessarily like publicly identify in that way. So we just know that there are a lot of people, like I can count many more that are in our database as a federation, but just might not qualify for this particular set of data because it's, you know, a little more academic, a little bit more rigorous. So it helps to give us an accurate view over the course of time. So you know, like we know the numbers are more right now, but if you're, you know, 30 years from now when we're looking back on it, I think these numbers, according to this set of data, will help us to understand like the long game numbers of the movement. So.
Yep.
Yeah. And Ricardo asks a question about the common challenges, whether or not interpersonal issues or conflicts were asked about in the survey.
So I actually don't believe that was offered as an option. I have to look back to the full list to quite recall. I don't know if Mo, if you remember if that was an option for the survey.
No, I don't. I think this was it. And this was, you know, one of the first times we've asked this question. So, you know, I think we're just trying to get a gauge on what people are thinking, and we'll probably review this question and add some more options into it next time around. But yeah, these were the only ones that were asked about.
Yeah. Those are most of our questions in the chat. I'm going to try and go through and find some others. We're going to go ahead and unmute folks, and you can ask questions a little more organically. You can go ahead and unmute yourself now. You should be able to. And
Ricardo, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah.
It looked like you had a question. No.
Well, while we're waiting, Mo, I'm wondering, did you want to speak more to this number about the rural co-op development that we've seen? So I mentioned that about 14% of worker co-ops across all states are in rural locations. I don't know if you wanted to speak to some of the funding things that the Federation is working on right now.
In the rural areas, yeah, I mean, we work, you know, in conjunction with a lot of our co-development members, with the Worker Cooperative, to support rural area cooperatives. I know a lot of you are really familiar with the RCDG grant, the Rural Cooperative Development Grant, and a lot that has been a really, really great support for the work that is happening across the country. It is how, honestly, we as the Federation get to go to, you know, like to North Carolina or to, you know, like any of the rural areas. You know, we're always trying to figure out ways to get to these locations and make sure that we're able to support not just the urban areas, but also the rural areas. So, you know, that number is like really quite big. We could probably do a whole report just on the rural cooperatives. And you know what, that might even be a good thing for DOWI to focus on in the future. I also, I can't recall if we actually covered this, but I just wanted to address the one question about Puerto Rico. There are 50 worker cooperatives that we have heard of in Puerto Rico. That was a number that came from a partner that's on the ground there. And we included it also in last year's State of the Sector. That wasn't a part of our survey, but we just did know that information. So we wanted to include it so that we could provide like a good picture of what was going on the ground. But that is definitely an area where we are going to be doing more work to work with partners in Puerto Rico to get like really accurate numbers and make sure that they're included in the data.
Thank you.
And there's one question from Deborah. Can you talk about the difference between what you mean when you say democratic workplaces versus worker cooperatives?
Sure. So I think the main difference is that a lot of democratic workplaces, there's not an aspect of ownership. So that might be due to the fact that it's not a traditional business, it's a nonprofit usually. So there is not a financial buy-in in the same way of a worker co-op that's a business.
Okay, and we may have a couple of questions from folks. Elias,
yeah. I just wanted to sort of issue an invitation. Back in December 16, there was a group Zoom call, and Melissa Hoover from DOWI was one of the people who was speaking on it. The call was a coalition of different groups interested in Pope Francis' economic agenda. There's a meeting coming up in March, and cooperatives are going to be a big deal at this meeting. So we see this coming, and we, you know, well before the event, we tried to get some people together on a Zoom call, and we got 140 people. And they were from DOWI, Madison Workers Co-op, Working World, Co-op Cincy, Wellbeing Economy Alliance, but also Citizen Climate Lobby, you know, Georgetown University, Catholic workers, evangelical folks. It was kind of all mixed up, activists. And so what we did was we were talking about what we wanted to see happen at this event. But actually, the second thing we wanted to do was connect with each other, because behind this group is an idea of putting together some new funding, like a startup fund for co-ops. And that conversation is now going on. these people that are involved in social impact investing are finding their way to the co-op world finally. So there's a lot of new conversation going there. And what I thought I would do is drop in a little registration link. The thing is free. It's tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern time, probably go for about an hour and a half. There's going to be several different little presentations, but part of the value is just seeing who else is in this group. There's now a Slack, so you can get on the Slack and maybe connect with people in your area, see people who are working on various kind of more special things. It's not 100% co-ops. It's also environmental, it's social care. There's other stuff going on. People are interested in economics, you know, so it's kind of a mix. But we're expecting another 150 people or so. And I think probably some of the folks maybe on this call, I'll just drop in the link here.
Yeah, that's great. If you want to drop the link into the chat to everyone, that'd be fantastic. Did you have another question, or was that just wanted to see if you could add
Just
that?
want to make people aware of that. It might be potentially good for networking, but maybe also potentially good for funding.
Great. Thank you so much. And
Sure.
I'll has the Slack there and the link there in the chat.
Yep.
Mo notes that we're having some technical difficulties in allowing people to unmute themselves. So we're gonna try and follow along with any other questions here in the chat if you do have them. Camille asks if you could clarify how many of the 465 worker co-ops are democratic.
Oh, can you repeat that? You cut off a little bit in the end.
How many of the 465 are democratic ESOPs? Camille asks.
I don't actually have that figure on hand. I don't know, Mo, if you have that.
I do not, but it's a great question that perhaps we can include, if we can dig that information up, we can include it in the follow-up email.
Sure.
That's a good question. And that goes to Brendan's as well, who wants to know if we do have that number, what percentage of worker co-ops versus democratic workplaces are included in that count. So we'll try to dig that up and get that to you all. Let's see, Ricardo asks about like the industry makeup, if there are any significant changes in industry over the past year.
No, not so we didn't include that information in this slideshow, but that information I think has generally stayed pretty steady over the last few years of data that we have.
Yeah. Excellent. I think those are all of most of the questions. If there are any final ones, now would be, oh, Susan asks about longevity. Is there anything we were able to tell about longevity in terms of cooperatives from the survey?
Well, like I mentioned, a lot of the worker cooperative field in general tend to be younger co-ops, so under 6 years old. But there's definitely a lot of examples of co-ops that have been around for a very long time. We actually recently tried to compare the business survival numbers of worker co-ops to traditional small businesses. And Mo, you can tell me if I'm getting these numbers correct. I think for 6 to 10 years, 25% of worker co-ops survived as compared to 18% of traditional small businesses. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yep. And then also for businesses that are more than 26 years old, the success rate is 14.7%, which is about 3% higher than typical small businesses. So I think that is something that I think is really important. They certainly don't all die off. A lot of them are young, but I think that actually speaks more to the fact that people are understanding the model in the country than it does with businesses closing. The exit rate is, I think that's information that you probably email Olga for, because I know we have it, but I don't recall if it's actually in the report. So the exit rate is also lower than the typical small business closure rate. So you know, it's all relative, right? I think sometimes it can be hard to hear, like, you know, this many businesses closed, but I think when we look at it in comparison to all businesses across the country, the numbers are actually pretty good.
I have a question. Do you have any numbers on how many co-ops there are out there devoted to like regenerative urban farming or foodscaping, landscaping, things like that?
Yeah, I think that would fall into this like industry breakdown, and we can certainly dig up those numbers specifically.
Yeah, I'd be curious. Thank you.
Yeah.
There are quite a few worker co-op farms, and I know that doesn't totally encapsulate what you're asking for right there, but we actually have a worker co-op farm peer network that's Kate Barut from the membership team is kind of like the staff point person on that, but
Great.
being led by workers. So if you want to email, I think membership@usworker.coop, we can hook you up with that community.
Awesome. Thank you.
Um,
That was membership at usworker.coop.
yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I'll also just respond to Ricardo here. The definitions and qualities of worker co-op, yeah, they're basically the same definitions. I think the difference, again, is really just the idea that we might consider people a worker co-op, but we don't include them in this report until they've been in business for a year and have, I think, paid staff. So, you know, there's a little bit of a difference in to what we consider a worker co-op and what's in this report, mostly just for stability reasons, because I think often we have a lot of people who inquire about startups. You know, we have at least 30 people come to almost every single worker co-op startup webinar, so we know there's a lot of interest. But I think in terms of like people kind of like actualizing that and getting to the point of paying staff members, it's a little bit different. So we try to make sure that the qualifications around it for this report are at a little bit of a higher bar.
We have a couple of questions related to like legislation and public support, but also place. I'm going to try and combine them and answer them both. So looking at specifically like New York, it says it has 58 on the map. That's the most on the map, and I think has surpassed the Bay Area in this most recent report. Can we at all tell from this survey kind of like what, I guess, what's the impact of public support on like regional growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this report gives some indication, and certainly the data that we have for the growth over the last 6 years definitely makes an argument for how that funding has supported growth in the area. But I think definitely a little bit more research is needed to understand impact a little bit better.
Yeah, I always like to kind of like anecdotally say it's definitely clear in New York that that the worker co-op movement can make $3.2 million go a long way. That is the amount of money that the city has committed to worker co-op development. And there's a handful of other cities like Santa Clara just recently, like Philadelphia, like Boston, that are getting money directly for either worker co-op development or towards you know, like state employer ownership centers, which I think is the case in Massachusetts. So, so yeah, I mean, there is a direct line. You know, I lead the policy efforts for the Federation, and I'm always trying to figure out different ways to share that information. So it's actually really helpful to hear these kinds of questions, to know, you know, what kind of packaging do people need in order to understand, you know, like how policy affects the growth of worker co-ops. Certainly a lot of the policy initiatives are geared specifically towards the idea of helping startups and also helping conversions. That those are kind of some of the major trends across the country right now, and also to do a lot of the education. You know, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act that passed in 2018 was a lot of it was geared toward conversions, and a lot of it was geared toward working with local small business development centers to educate people about the worker co-op model. So I think a lot of times people just really aren't familiar with the model, and that's the thing that will help to spur a lot more movement in the sector. So. Thanks
so much, Mo. Linda asks a question about conversions versus startups, whether or not this year's State of the Sector can tell us anything about like the future. What does it look like? Or the outlook? What does it say for the outlook of conversions?
What a great question. I think just kind of looking at this graph, there's definitely a trend of conversions that you can see is evident. I think we definitely can't tell what the implication is for the future or how quickly the field might grow, but there's definitely an upwards trend that we're seeing.
And just to add to that, we just saw, not when this report was completed, but we just saw numbers for 2019 that they meet kind of where 2017 was, or actually a little bit higher. Interesting question from Ricardo, wondering if the folks who did the survey and have analyzed the data had any aha moments or insights based on the survey responses. What are you most excited by, or what are you most concerned about based on the data? I guess that's for both of you, and Mo and Olga.
Well, I think from my input, I think the average pay was kind of an exciting number. Definitely, I think that's super intriguing. There's a million more questions that I have about wanting to dig into that. So I think that was kind of the biggest aha moment that I've seen.
For me, the biggest one was actually in the report last year as well, but it continues to be the case, which is exciting, is the pay ratio. I had never thought about that before this report, but the fact now that we can go to people and say, you know, our average corporations have a 303-to-1 ratio between the highest paid person and the lowest paid person, but worker co-ops stick to generally around either like a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio. That is a really powerful, amazing thing to be able to say to people in the face of what I think a lot of people are feeling right now in the country is like a lot of inequity, right? Like people don't understand and don't agree with, and I totally agree with it, that the people are making wild amounts of money, right? So making sure that the people that are creating value are able to keep that value is really, really important. So I think that's been really incredibly powerful for a lot of people, both inside and outside the movement, especially outside the movement. So just understand what is the potential of worker co-ops to not just, you know, like have a strong business, not just keep it rooted in the community. Those things are incredibly important. And also to manage how a business treats wages and profits in the face of like an increasingly inequitable economy. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Mo. And Austin asks a question, not specifically related to the report, but I think you might have a good question, or a good answer rather. Service providers for co-ops. Is there a list of service providers? Where can someone find either like a database or a list of service providers by state?
So you can actually go to the Federation's website right now. We have under resources a referral directory. I'm going to drop the link in here. We work on this with Dowie, and it's also, I will say, in the midst of like an overhaul. We have, let me see, we have, it looks like 33 providers that are on here. Right now, we're in the midst of just trying to clean it up and make sure that we have the latest information for people. So I encourage you to get in touch with us. I wonder if Ricardo wants to talk a little bit about the lawyers and other service providers directory here, but I also think he can't unmute, so maybe not. But there's a couple different efforts to make sure that we understand who is out there in terms of technical assistance, and that including, you know, lawyers, bookkeepers, CPAs, different kinds of consultants. We really want to make sure that we're covering that information, and that's a thing that Dowie and the Federation work on together. So.
And this one is also for you, Mo, probably. Do you envision co-ops potentially becoming a cornerstone for the Green New Deal concept? You might have some insight given your advocacy experience.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we have actually been in talks with AOC's office a little bit about the Green New Deal. I'm like, what does that actually really look like? How does that play out? right? And we believe and we know that as she's publicly stated, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believes that it is actually really central to the Green New Deal, making sure that those jobs are stable jobs that are able to develop workforces into not just like any old job, but a job that really um, really makes a difference and is able to give people skills that they didn't previously have. So for instance, we're looking at housing, right? So the part of the Green New Deal is about creating buildings that are LEED certified, buildings that are like sustainable in material and how they're constructed. And one idea that we have talked about is the idea of creating workforce development programs so that construction workers can create worker cooperatives able to meet the demand of making these kinds of buildings, right? So there's a lot of different ways that it could to play out. I also always want to give a shout out to our members that are working in the solar industry, because they're doing a lot of work to provide like solar energy to Coops across the country, and like businesses like TFS and PV Squared are doing that work, and those are really central to the Green New Deal. So I think the worker co-op movement has this opportunity to not just create businesses, but meet the demand that the world really needs. So we are always very eager and excited to track any business, particularly with regard to kind of like the legislative initiatives of the moment, especially the Green New Deal.
Great. Thanks so much, Mo. I do want to make sure that we have time to kind of wrap up and let everyone, or not hold everyone too long here on the call. But those are excellent questions. One more I'm just going to try and grab a couple more. One from Ricardo. The second part of his questions were if there are any concerns based on the data for this year. I'm actually going to tie that to another one, which is like, what are the strategies for growth, right? Can you combine those in an answer?
Sure. Well, maybe I can start off and you can feel free to jump in. I would definitely say not necessarily concerns about anything. I think this data just kind of points us to ask more questions in certain directions. So I don't think there's necessarily anything that worries anyone specifically in the data.
Yeah, I think it's like a little bit less like this data, and also more just kind of like in general. I think a lot about do we have what we need in place to meet the demand of conversions? Even we have this federal bill that promotes conversions, and I know there are a lot of really great organizations that are doing the hard work to figure that out, including DOWI, including like Project Equity and ITA Group that are really thinking about conversions and what does it look like for a really big scale business to convert, and that kind of goes back to like how worker co-ops get started, because we've seen that piece of the pie that has to do with conversions like tick up over the last few years, and something that I'm always mindful of is like who are we training up to make sure that we understand like what do you need to make that kind of deal happen, and at a scale. So like for businesses that are like larger, what do we need in place in order to meet that kind of demand? Because we last October we met with multiple candidates who were at the time were running for president, which to me I take as a really great indicator that people are really starting to catch on to the idea of worker co-ops, and we're going to see people promoting it, and especially conversions, and how will we meet that? So I think we're getting there. I know that the Workers to Owners Collaborative is thinking specifically about this work, and I encourage all of you to look at becomingemployeeowned.org to make sure that you kind of understand what are the resources that are out there and what are the stories that we're telling. So I think that's a really great resource for that, but usually that's the thing that my mind goes to, like how are we able to meet the needs that are coming up?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mo, and thank you, Olga. And thanks everyone for the questions. Excellent questions that really help us think deeply about all this information. Olga, if you could advance to slide 16, just so everyone can see where to download the report right there. You can go to institute.coop and find it there on our homepage. And then our next slide, we're going to have, Mo's going to tell us a little bit about our upcoming conference.
Yeah, so if you did not already save the date, please make sure that you do. The Worker Co-op Conference, previously the Worker Co-op National Conference, but we're trying to save you a couple mouthfuls of words, is coming up on September 11th to 13th here on the Federation's home base here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You can stay tuned for information at conference.coop. You know, the registration we anticipate is going to open in March, so you can look forward to that. We look forward to seeing a lot of your faces there. Very excited about that. And then if you go to the next slide, I'll just kind of give some shout outs to some other things that we have coming up. So, you know, if you care about this information, definitely please support the Federation and DOWI, become a sustainer. You know, you can look at our financials. It takes a lot to do this work, and member dues do not cover all of it. So it always is really helpful if people sustain this work of making sure that the movement is like moving forward. So, there's that. There's the co-op clinic, which is the Federation's kind of like technical assistance arm, where we have peer advisors, like people who have been worker owners and people who are very like closely tied to the movement to give technical assistance to your co-op if you need it. There's a couple upcoming events. We're having a co-op clinic webinar on bylaws. So if you are starting your worker co-op and you want to understand how to like shape your governance documents, this will be a really, really great webinar for you. If you're interested in some of the policy aspects of this, I encourage you to join our Policy and Advocacy Council. It meets twice a month. One meeting is members only. That's the third Thursday of the month. And one meeting is about updates. And basically anybody can come to that. So if you're interested in learning about what's going on in worker co-op policy and advocacy land, I encourage you to come to that. And then if you want to learn a bit more about starting your own worker co-op, you can go to our startup webinar, which is on March 6th. And then I think, Julian, there's a couple webinars coming up for the School for Democratic Management. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, we're featuring a few interviews that I think a lot of people will find interesting. First, with John Abrams of South Mountain Company, who's going to be joining us on April 16th for an interview about succession planning. South Mountain has been successful for a number of decades now. And then we're going to have a couple of sessions with Esteban Kelly, Executive Director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, who's going to talk about facilitation. First, facilitation basics, and then getting into more of like how we manage tensions within meetings and how to do that effectively. And those events with Esteban are going to be on April 22nd and May 13th. You can sign up or register at democraticmanagement.org. And